All right, thank you all for being here at my capstone defense. My name is Finnegan Hein, and this is the material and algorithmic exploration of mycorrhizal fungi. My capstone committee is Courtney Starrett, Michael Gayk, and Brian Shaw. The contents of this presentation include my abstract, introduction, methodology, and conclusion. This project is a stylized interpretation of the natural phenomena of mycorrhizal fungi, particularly Amanita muscaria, and how it forms symbiotic relationships with plants. Focused on themes of mutualism, I explored the union between 2D traditional media and 3D digital media, as well as 2D animation and 3D animation. It investigated the foundations of L systems through procedural modeling and growth algorithms to illustrate that the survival strategies that these organisms have developed can also be viewed and simulated as algorithms. Before we begin, I would like to first show the final video. Yeah, go ahead. First, I'll take you through my inspirations. So, three main artists inspired the look of my project, first of which was Esther Morales. She captures her subject's movement with graphic line quality and often uses patterns to describe the form. Lander Striegebold abstracts nature with cubist perspective as well as the use of geometric shapes. And Cody Gindy inspired my use of alcohol marker textures applied to 3D models as well as my approach to using alpha maps to create naturalistic lighting. For the story, I was inspired by mycorrhizal fungi, which are a type of fungi that form a symbiotic relationship with plant roots by creating an interface where they can provide nutrients and protection to the plant in exchange for sugars. This project is a stylized representation of this natural process that informs, provides context, and creates content for this natural phenomenon that is unknown to the general population yet prevalent worldwide. This iconic red fungus is called Amanita muscaria, and it is the most recognizable fungus in the world as depicted in Super Mario, Disney's Fantasia, and the iconography of Christmas. As a mycorrhizal fungus, it is part of a process that holds great ecological importance. More than 90% of current land plants are associated with mycorrhizal fungi, making them the most widespread of fungal symbionts. Moving on to my methodology. In the concept phase, I sought to approach abstraction in similar ways to Esther Morales and Lander Striegebold by focusing on reducing natural formations to their basic geometric shapes and line qualities. I also tried to play with perspective in cubist ways while considering how they would translate into 3D. And one of my favorite pastimes is going outside and sketching nature, oftentimes with alcohol markers. So I felt like a natural step in my artistic journey to explore this look further in 3D. Once I had enough concepts, I was able to bring them all together and create a 2D animatic that became kind of my North Star and blueprint for this project. As you can see, a lot of my shot compositions are pretty one-to-one from the 2D animatic compared to the final video. My main goal for this animatic was to block out the story of Mycorrhiza visually and stylistically. This also helped me settle on the scope of the project and gave me the opportunity to build a mental roadmap for the types of effects and design problems that I would have to face to create this animation, such as the smoke effect. The primary consideration for my 3D modeled assets was how they looked according to the camera's perspective. Typically, it is best practice to create orthographic concept drawings of a model to visually describe how it should look from the top, front, and side. However, because I was both the concept artist and the modeler for this project, I was able to forego this protocol because making orthographic views reduces the amount of artistic decisions that you can make in the modeling process. And in my experience, much of the joy of 3D animation is the translation of 2D work to its 3D representation. So I took a more free-form approach in this stage of the pipeline. Plants branch in complex ways that would be time-consuming to model by hand. In some cases, there are identifiable patterns to how plants grow and branch as seen in the plumeria bush. To solve this design problem, I sought to investigate how I could model these natural processes algorithmically. So as you can see here with this plumeria bush, it grows out with an initial stem and then it branches into three, and all of those branches then grow out, and then eventually they also all branch into three. So there's a clear pattern of growth. To model the branching structures, I used L systems or Lindenmayer systems, which are a set of rules that can be used to create complex patterns from a set of instructions. L system commands are a way of communicating how a line or branching lines should be drawn, and these commands can be simple step-by-step functions that inform which direction, what angle, and how long each segment should be. L system commands can create complexity by calling upon themselves in ways that rewrite the previous generation or add to it recursively. A recursive function is when the defining variable is called on both sides of the function. This means that it will call itself after every generation. So you can see here this model branches in the same way as the plumeria bush. There's an initial stem, and then it branches into three, and then each of those branches into three, and so on. To further illustrate this concept, at the end of the plant roots, I created a function called y. This function tells the L system to build this U shape that you see here on the left in one generation. And then because I call the y function at the end of itself, in the next generation, it will add another u where the y was specified, and so on. So within this rule 2, this y equals, halfway through the function, it calls y within itself, and then at the end, it calls y within itself. And those points are the ends of each of these branches here. So at 2 generations, it grows that U shape at the end of each branch, and so on. So if I were to change this to be 1,000 generations, it would create complexity exponentially. These iterations add more and more detail that would be very tedious to craft using traditional modeling methods. And in some instances, recursion was not applicable. Because there's no clear pattern in my concept for this model, each branching line was given individual instruction by hand. Instead of calling itself, each function is a step-by-step instruction on how each line should be drawn from start to finish. So again, with this concept, there's no clear recursive pattern. So each of these lines describes how these should grow from each of these individual branches and then every subsequent branch. So all of this instruction basically tells it what angle and length and direction each of these steps should be. These two approaches are how I informed the shapes of the tree trunk models. I also interpolated the curves and created a taper effect to get a more organic look. To create the leaves of the plant, I used L systems to draw polygon surfaces and join them together to form the shape of the leaf. One polygon surface pattern is the chordate leaf, and the chordate leaf is a two-sided leaf with a spiral beginning at the stem and then spiraling downwards back towards the origin point. I repurposed this logic to design the leaves on my hero plant. I removed one side and changed the spiraling effect from wrapping downwards towards the stem to making it spread more gradually upwards. This was accomplished by adding a step at the beginning of the function, and this created an initial branch at the set angle before the polygon is created, which offsets the starting point of each new generation. So instead of these triangles beginning at this same origin point every time and spiraling down, there's this initial step before each new triangle grows so that it grows more gradually upwards. After completing the 3D models, I began to UV unwrap them, which is the process of unfolding the model into 2 dimensions while still maintaining representation, similar to map projections of the globe. I did this with the intention of eventually printing these UV maps out and texturing the models using alcohol markers. For assets composed of multiple separate models, I made the UV shells proportional in size for consistency across the weight of the marker brush strokes. However, for the rest of the models, I favored a larger UV shell over consistent proportions so as not to require as much precise penmanship. Similar to the symbiotic relationship between the mycorrhizal fungi and the plant, this process is a marriage between traditional and digital forms of art. This approach opened the door for otherwise separate artistic processes to work together in aesthetic ways. Alcohol markers are an additive medium, meaning values can be layered from light to dark, but not the other way around. I utilized digital painting software to create the base color designs, so I was free to layer light and dark values over each other in interesting ways. So that's what you see here on the left side. All 80 UV tile designs were printed at 12 by 12 inches with the UV shells often filling most of the space. I used a light box to transfer these printouts onto multimedia paper, but there were multiple limiting factors to my process, one of which was that the larger UVs meant more ink needed to be applied to the page, which meant that I ran out of ink more often. Interestingly, the most successful moments in the final base color textures were the locations where the ink was close to running dry. These were the moments where the alcohol marker process was most apparent and resulted in the sketchbook quality that I was aiming to achieve. So this one was one that I chose specifically because you can see the ink is slightly running dry and you can see these brush strokes, I guess, these marker strokes. I treated each UV texture as its own piece of art, so each piece demanded a full amount of attention. I paid an equal amount of attention to detail to all of these UVs, whether it was a hero asset or a background asset. For some of the patterns, I drew inspiration from African textiles, particularly Kuba cloth, which is a traditional fabric from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And many of the textures have patterns that resemble cellular forms, regimented networks, and searching lines that create a unity between the story and the visuals. Each marker texture became its own engaging piece of art, reminiscent of an herbarium, where plants are preserved and reduced from their natural way of existing in three-dimensional space to a flattened representation of itself. The resulting art was 3 times removed from its original source, and each one became an extreme abstraction of life. I used watercolors to paint the backgrounds, ground planes, and less complex assets, which is a process often implemented in early animated films. Because these are flat planes, I added perspective and atmospheric depth to create the illusion of space, and this was enhanced by defocusing the backgrounds in the scene. When completed, I scanned each page into the computer at 1200 dpi to maximize resolution and oriented the scans to fit the UVs of the models. Finally, I brought the textures into Blender and applied them to my 3D models. Once I had models and textures, I could begin to set dress the environments and revise my compositions. The left side shows how digital painted assets looked when applied to the models, while the right side features the handmade textures. These side-by-sides show that the textures would not have been effective if I had stopped at the digital painting stage. Turns out there's no more effective way to make something look like a sketchbook than to sketch it by hand. I added subsurface scattering for most shaders because organic material often has a slightly translucent quality. And I used cycles to render because it is physically based rendering and I wanted all the light interactions to be as realistic as possible. To approach the growth animations of the fungi and plants, I considered their ways of traversing life as living algorithms. A plant's roots, in an algorithmic sense, take input from their surroundings, which are the location of nutrients, water, gravity, etc. It then makes decisions based on these factors by sending signals through the rest of the plant via hormones to determine whether to promote or halt growth. The ultimate outcome is a root system that is well suited to the specific environment, as well as a stabilizing structure to act as a foundation for the growth above the soil. To simulate this survival strategy, I copied circles along the curve that I created here using L systems and connected the mesh using a skin node. From here, I added a keyframed carve node to reveal the curve from the starting point to simulate growth. However, this method only worked for the parts of the curve that did not branch because it would double back and create unwanted geometry artifacts. You can see here. So instead, I keyframed the branching mesh from 0 to 2 generations. Alternatively, the mycorrhizal fungi is in search of a plant's roots and expands radially until those roots are discovered. Because of this distinction, the mycelium simulation demanded an expanding structure seeking to explore and colonize. I sought to portray this radial expansionary method of growth through an algorithm based on replicating points from a single point. By creating a nebulous web of lines, I was able to then add a polywire UV node to create geometry for the points to generate onto. One point is scattered onto the mesh in a random location and made to stick to it. The point's life value starts at 0 and increments each frame, and if the point's life value is greater than its lifespan value, the total number of points is below the maximum number of points, and it's not too close to a neighboring point, then the point will replicate. The original point restarts the process, and new points are slightly offset and have different directions of movement. After the solver has created the simulation of points, lines are generated between adjacent points based on distance. The importance of this scene was to show that the mycelium is a problem-solving, decentralized organism that is branching and expanding everywhere at once. I used this same methodology to generate the expanded root system in the second to last shot. The difference between the first time and the last time the mycelium is shown is that after it has created the mycorrhizal interface and found water and nutrients, the hyphal connections to those resources are reinforced. The growth of the individual hypha, which are the filamentous strands that branch and make up the mycelium, responds to its environment similarly to the root tips, taking input from their surroundings and reacting accordingly. However, this process happens at a much smaller scale than the plant, and since Amanita muscaria is an ectomycorrhizal fungi, it means that it grows around the individual plant cells as opposed to inside of them, as you can see here in this diagram. Additionally, the hypha doesn't grow, it gets longer, with individual cells dividing at the tip. Because of this, I centered this simulation around the idea of cell division. The logic behind the simulation is the same as the expanding mycelium, but instead of connecting adjacent points, individual points are converted into VDB spheres, which are later converted into mesh. This is also the simulation I used to create the title sequence. Additionally, instead of using a nebulous web of lines, each point must follow this L system path that I created to animate the ectomycorrhizal interface. To add life to the lighting, I layered alpha maps of branches and leaves and subtly animated their location and scale. I also included volumetric lighting to the hero spotlight so that a beam of light would be shown, otherwise all that would render in scene were the surfaces that the light would hit. The beginning of the short follows a series of 3 establishing shots that emphasize the theme of symbiosis in different ways. All of these scenes include the use of both 2D and 3D animation by incorporating frame-by-frame drawings in the 3D scene using grease pencil, contributing to the tradition of hybrid animation. The merging of these two mediums goes hand in hand with the relationships they are representing. To make the grease pencil assets look integrated in the scene, each drawing needed to be angled according to the camera's view. This meant that at any other camera angle, the assets would not look proportional. Hans Holbein played with this concept in his painting The Ambassadors, where he painted an elongated skull that only appears proportional at a glancing angle. Hans uses this method to challenge the viewer's perspective on mortality, but I used it to force the perspective and integration of 2D elements into the 3D scene. The first scene emphasizes a commensalistic relationship between lily pads, frogs, and fish. Lily pads provide resting spots for frogs as well as shade for fish, and I was inspired by the stylization of these animals in ancient sculptures. So this is a marble frog from the Shang dynasty. Here's a Tayrona butterfly nose ornament from Colombia, and this scene shows a mutualistic relationship between butterflies and plants where the flower provides the butterfly with nectar while the butterfly helps pollinate the plant. The third features leafcutter ants, which have a symbiotic relationship with the fungus Leucoagaricus gongylophoros. The ants bring the mycelium leaves for energy and cultivate the mycelium for themselves. By establishing scenes with grease pencil as the visual language to show symbiosis, the climax ties back to the beginning of the short by utilizing this same strategy for the microscopic plant cells. This reinforces the similarities between these relationships. Building on this premise, I played with the concept of parallax and 2D assets to create the illusion of depth and form as an experiment in 2.5D animation. This is when 2D assets are used to create the illusion of 3D space. To apply this technique, I arranged multiple grease pencil assets to form one tree asset. I then placed each asset far apart from each other, and the camera's movement caused parallax between the elements. So it looks like the camera is rotating around this 3D object. Compositing the grease pencil animations into the scene proved to be a considerable challenge. By default, all of the 3D assets are rendered first, and the grease pencil assets are superimposed on top of the render, regardless of where it is placed in the 3D scene. My solution was to separate each visual layer into its own render layer and add them together using alpha over nodes. I added motion blur, bloom, and lens distortion, which created a visual cohesion from shot to shot. And I also separated every light into its own light group and added each render pass back together in compositing. This allowed for greater control in adjusting the lighting if needed, and only included the volumetric lighting when necessary. So this is before, you can see the volume is affecting this model, and this is after adding them together. The music I created further emphasized the story and theme of mutualism by representing the plant with an acoustic guitar and the Amanita muscaria with an electric guitar with the use of wah-wah pedal. This created tension between the two life forms as they were represented by two contrasting sounds. The rising tension and resolution are reinforced by the acoustic guitar being reintroduced in union with the electric guitar, relieving the tension between the two and merging into one harmonious sound. Now that I have taken you through my process, I would like to show the final video again. In conclusion, my workflow of using 2D traditional media and 3D digital animation, as well as combining 2D animation and 3D animation, created a coherent style that strengthened the theme of symbiosis. Studying fungi is essential in understanding how ecosystems work, and yet we have only studied approximately 6% of fungi in the world. Perhaps as new plant and fungi species are discovered and studied, L systems can be used in new and interesting ways to solve algorithms previously uncharted in the tree of life. The softwares I used were primarily Blender, Procreate, Adobe Photoshop, Premiere, and Houdini. Special thanks to my committee, Courtney Starrett, my committee chair, and Michael Gayk and Brian Shaw, committee members, as well as my parents and brother, all of my friends and family, and the visualization faculty. Here are all of my sources for this presentation. And now I'd like to open it up to any questions that you all might have.